All right, so good afternoon. We want to start on time because we have a full schedule of wonderful speakers today. Thank you all for coming at this time of day, and we hope that you will enjoy some of the snacks and the drinks in the back there. My name is Dr. Lori Walton. I am the interim director of Ellacuría Initiative on campus, and we would like to thank you for attending tonight's Ellacuría Initiative Title 42, Justice at the Border. At this moment, when many, including the media, are tempted to use images or words that dehumanize and push people traveling to the U.S. to seek a better life for their families, we, as a Jesuit university, are called to move in closer. We're called to humanize, to listen with hearts, to let ourselves be changed by people who are both different from and similar to us. We are called to open our minds, our homes, and our communities in the same way God is open to the beauty of our diversity, our gifts, and our limitations. We hope that in this gathering tonight, we can explore and unfortunately injustice, seeking to understand and emanate cura personalis, and to continue our work as a university and as a community toward a more just and inclusive society. We will offer you the opportunity to share honestly about our own experiences of welcome and exclusion and the impact that this has had on each of us individually and as a community, as well as reflect on our own Ignatian values and what it means to move beyond our own comfort zones and imagine how we can advocate for and with others in our community and beyond. So I will now hand over the program to Dr. Tiffany Bordonata. She is the professor in the Department of Counseling and Human Services and the co-program director of Clinical Mental Health and Counseling for the graduate program.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. So tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker for the program, Dr. Mike Allison. Dr. Allison is a professor and chair of political science and a member of the Latin American and Latinx Studies program. He has been traveling to Central America for 25 years. He was the recipient of a Fulbright Teaching Research Award to Guatemala in 2013, and previously a Fulbright Student Scholar Award to El Salvador in 1997. Dr. Allison has been to the U.S. Mexico border several times, including trips to Arizona with the KINO Border Initiative and to El Paso, Texas. He teaches courses on Latin American politics and U.S. Latin American relations, and recently co-authored a textbook on U.S. and Latin American relations. Finally, he has provided expert witness testimony in approximately 100 cases involving Salvadoran and Guatemalan nationals seeking asylum in the United States. He is currently working with a dozen University of Scranton students on asylum cases as part of the Faculty Student Research Program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison.
All right, thanks for coming this afternoon. I know you were all expecting Ryan Sheehan, but he got pulled away, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of double duty right now. Talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching maybe, and immigration, as well as the KINO Border Initiative before turning it over to the next speakers, and then coming back and talking a little bit more about Title 42, which is a little bit more of the topic of today's event. Okay? To start off, I just wanted to, put in a little bit of context, right? And that right now in the world, we have about 7.4 billion people or so, and roughly 300 million people, if I get rid of this, are living outside of their homes, right? And so we're really in a period of pretty, a world on the move, people on the move, right? The vast majority of those, well, I guess you can think, about 90 million of those 300 million have been forced to leave their homes because of violence or the fear of violence, the threat of violence, right? So roughly 200 million have left their homes for economic opportunities. Another 90 million is for violence. Of those 90 million who fled, roughly 55 million or more internally displaced persons. So they've been forced to leave their homes, but they're still within the borders of their country. And then we look at these other two categories, which is a little bit more of the context for today of looking at refugees and asylum seekers, which are roughly 35 million people in the world. Right? And so we have roughly 35 million who've left their home countries to seek safety outside of their borders. And they've fled, generally because they have either been persecuted or feared persecution based upon their race, religion, ethnicity, language, political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group, right? More recently, we also include just people who fled their countries or their areas because of war, right? A generalized war that they've left. And they can be considered refugees if they're identified or they're vetted by usually the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, or if they've come to another country and border, they might be fleeing for the same reasons, but they'll be seeking asylum, which is a little bit different that we'll talk about. And the question is how do we respond, right, to roughly 90 million people who fled their homes because of violence or the fear of violence? And so a little bit of what we were going to talk about today is, Catholic social teaching, what the KINO Border Initiative does, as well as Title 42, which I just lumped under the U.S. government policy right now. Right? We'll also hear from a couple of speakers. We'll talk about, what's going on here in Lackawanna County and Scranton. So that'll be right in the middle. Right? So again, what does Catholic social teaching on immigration tell us or, call for us to respond to the movement of peoples, right? And we think about it from three principles, right? One is that people have the right to migrate, to sustain their lives and the lives of their families, right? And that we were not put on this planet to suffer, right? That we have the right to a dignified life, right? We have every opportunity or right to receive from the earth what is necessary for life, food, clothing, shelter, security, right? So people have the right to move for that. And even within this, the church really says that the native has no superior rights over the immigrant. Right? Basic foundation of what the Catholic Church is calling on all of us to do, or what our rights are when we feel that we're no longer safe in our home communities. Right? And the second one is more a country, right? So not the person or the family that has the right to move, but countries also have the right to regulate their borders, to control immigration, right? To establish who can come in, who can't, how to give visas or permits for people to come. But there's sort of a basic understanding that you're not doing it out of your own self-interest, right? You're trying to figure out how does the laws around your border contribute to the common good, right? So again, as an individual, as a country, you can't really just decide what is moral, right, just based on our own self-interest, our own personal interest, but it should be broader than that contributes to the common good. And the third that sort of combines those first two is that, country must regulate its borders with justice and mercy, right? So it comes around people have the right to move, families have the right to move, but governments have the right to, enforce their borders, make up rules, but that they should do it in a way that prioritizes justice and mercy. And that's in many ways where we all come into play to help determine what, in our context in the United States, would be a just and merciful response to people who have fled their homes because of violence and have asked for safety in the United States or who have shown up at our borders. And for the church, really, the undocumented migrant, right, the one who's come not with permission, it is especially vulnerable and therefore especially important for our consideration. And so, I think at the end of today, it's a little bit of what you and your groups will be discussing about what would be your response, right? But we also see that others have responded that I was asked to talk a little bit about was the KINO Border Initiative, right? It was an organization started nearly 20 years ago now. It's a binational organization involving the diocese, a couple of dioceses in California, Arizona, and northern Mexico, where individuals from the Catholic Church had come together to try and figure out what is a way that we should respond to the challenge of people who need protection along the U.S. Mexico border. And so the KINO Border Initiative, again, it's supported by the Catholic diocese in the region, but it's also inspired by the spirituality of the Jesuits. And it's located in Nogales, Mexico, which is a border community between Arizona and Mexico. Right? So if you travel there, if you have traveled there, there's a wall that divides what used to be a single city or binational city that's now been divided in two. There's really interesting history and story behind the region. That I won't get into that part now, but it's just thinking about in terms of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits came together 20 years ago to figure out what to do, and they said we're going to come up with this organization to serve the people in need along the border, and our vision is to do it, to look at migrants and to work with them through life, or to respect their dignity, right? To promote humane, just, and workable migration. And the KINO Border Initiative is meant to really provide support for people who are stuck at the border, but to also provide, and this didn't happen right away, but to really help to bring together people in the United States, in Mexico, to better understand what was happening along the border. And so many of us might have been on immersion trips or service trips to the border itself. With the hope that this relationship that we would develop on our volunteer or service at the border would build solidarity, right? That we would not necessarily be resolving any of the problems at the border, but we'd have a better understanding of it. And then we could come home and figure out what to do with it. And the KINO Border Initiative, the third part, is really about education and advocacy, right? Their job was to serve those in need, serve us by helping us to understand what's going on at the border, but then also to try and affect policy in the United States and in Mexico to change the conditions on the ground. And so if you've been to the border, you can volunteer there and provide basic services for migrants, it's who they've served has changed over time, but it was really always meant to be people in transit, migrants, right? Not the stable community in Nogales, Mexico. And so initially, the first time I went there, you went in and there were like 70, 80 people being served food, and maybe 72 or 73 of them were men. That they had been deported from the United States, or they were come from Central America heading north. The next few times I went back, you started to see larger numbers of people, but also instead of 72 out of 73 or 74 out of 75 men, it would be like 60. And then you'd have 15 women or so. And then next time I went back, it was more women, but also kids, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds there. And so who the KINO Border Initiative has served has really changed in terms of primarily men to family units. They've moved from providing just like food, but I know some of our nurses, we were there and they were providing medical treatment to those who were there. Yumile Silva was doing interpretation, and so there was handing out clothes and jeans and combs and brushes for those who had been deported from the United States or might have spent days in the desert. We also see that, we've been sending faculty, right? This was one of the groups that I was on probably 10 years ago now. One of the first groups, Scranton's, blessed or in some ways that we went really before KINO had an official program of receiving tours or groups. So Ryan Sheehan always likes to, highlight that part. So we've sent faculty and staff. Student trips have been going. We actually had, in this building, I hosted the Jesuit University's Humanitarian Action Network Student Leadership Conference here at the university. And so we had Barbara King, and this is Joanna Williams up on your right. When I started, she was there giving like the educational information sessions to groups that were showing up. And now she runs the KINO Border Initiative as more the executive director. And she was standing right here, as you can tell from this picture. 6 years ago, I guess 7 years ago, when she came here and was telling us about the work of the KINO Border Initiative and everything that they had been doing on the ground for these years. And then we've also changed, I guess, the direction of our contributions. Anyone know who this is? Isaiah Leivelsberger, right? So Isaiah is a long-term volunteer right now at the KINO Border Initiative. He graduated last year, and he's here. He sent me the picture this morning. They were making garlic knots, at the new KINO Border Initiative, right? So there was a comedor, like small place that had been set up right across the border that you could walk across, and now they're a little bit larger there. But so now we've had them here, and we've visited there, and now we've sent Isaiah there to volunteer for about, he has a few more months left, but he's been there about 7 or 8 months. What I'll talk about in a little while, if we think about what Catholic social teaching called for us to respond, what the KINO Border Initiative is actually doing to carry out sort of the mission or the life of Catholic social teaching, but then we start thinking about how are we as a country supposed to respond? And how have we responded to the challenges at our border with Mexico? And this was today's discussion a little bit, or the discussion we'll be having about Title 42. Right? And so Title 42 is a U.S. public health code, or Code Title 42, that comes out of the CDC, or allows the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, to put limitations on who can and cannot come into the United States if there's a public health emergency or a public health crisis. And so this was put into place not that long after really COVID arrived here in the United States, where we began to shut down in early March of 2020. I think it was about March 13th that year here, where we had our last day or so before we went remote. And then March 20th, the CDC policy went into effect, which, after the next presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about, but basically it's the Department of Health and Human Services says we're going to restrict entry into the United States because of a public health emergency in our own country, but also where people might be coming from. And there's questions that we'll see, I'll talk about afterwards, but some of the problems with Title 42, but one of the main ones that really where we think it came from in March of 2020 came out of the Department of Homeland Security, and it came out of the White House. And it was a directive, right, just to say that we will no longer be processing or letting anyone into the United States because of COVID. But it was used selectively, really just to prevent people who were coming to the U.S. border with Mexico. They were the ones who were the recipient of this policy, which was one of the main reasons why most health professionals, including those in the CDC at the time, questioned its legality and its applicability. Because if there was a public health emergency in our country, which there was, and in Mexico, it should have been more applied to everybody versus simply really being used as an effort to restrict people from coming to the U.S. border and applying for asylum. All right, so I'm going to take a little break, I guess, hear from others about what's going on in Lackawanna County. We have an introduction here, and then we'll get back to talking a little bit more specifically about Title 42. That was Ryan Sheehan's talk. Excuse me.
That was part one from you, so don't go away. All right, so now I would like to introduce our next two speakers. We have Julie Schumacher-Cohen, who is the Assistant Vice President of Community Engagement and Government Affairs at the University of Scranton. She chairs the university's Community-Based Learning Board and manages various projects and initiatives, including serving as the project director for the Scranton Story. I hope all of you went to at least part of those stories that are ongoing. Our Nation's Story project, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, coordinating the Living Wage Report community-based study, and other programs to support refugee solidarity, racial and economic justice, and civic dialogue. Prior to Scranton, she worked for several nonprofit organizations in community outreach, cross-cultural relations, and peace and social justice, including as Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C.-based Churches for Middle East Peace. She holds an MPA from Villanova University and is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in political science at Temple University. I would also like to introduce our other speaker that will come up with Julie as Jenny Gonzalez, who is a licensed social worker who works at Marywood University as the STARS program director. STARS stands for Students Together Achieving Remarkable Success. STARS is an after-school program that offers Latino, Latina, and Latinx youth in the Scranton area the opportunity to explore their long-term career goals through academic assistance and exposure to diverse post-secondary educational paths, trades, and career. Jenny has been working with and advocating for the civil and immigrants' rights of the growing immigrant and refugee populations in Northeast Pennsylvania for almost a decade through her work at the Community Justice Project. This has included advocating for immigrants' access to public benefits, subsidized housing, equitable education, language access, immigration representation, and much more. We are so honored to have you. Thank you. Just do a little PowerPoint adjustment here.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Walton, and we're so glad to be here. I'm going to just give actually a few of the opening slides, and then I'm going to turn things over to Jenny. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about the Scranton context, and I think it's always important to think about Scranton sort of historically, because it is a city that often sort of touts itself or thinks about itself as an immigrant destination. And historically, it grew as a city in the industrial era because it welcomed immigrants from obviously mostly European countries at the time. This was a city that grew because of coal mining and other industries. And you can see the kind of ancestry of population. So people came from Ireland, they came from Italy, they came from Germany, Poland, Wales, and England. And those ethnic makeups are really reflect a lot of the communities today. So Scranton still reflects that immigrant community, that the groups that came in the early 1900s. And it grew. So from 1886, it was a small city, 35,000 people, went to its height to about 100,000. And then it stayed steady because we've had, obviously, out-migration of communities because of the decline of coal mining and because we have never had one big industry since then that's been kind of the one that's fueled us. But Scranton is a changing city. And I like to share this kind of provocative title of a newspaper article from a couple years ago that said, "Scranton is white and old no more. Forget everything you think you know about Scranton." And no offense to older adults, not my title, but the point being that Scranton is often known as a white working class city. It is a predominantly white city. You can see that. It's still 70% a white city, but it's also has a longstanding African American community, and it has a really growing Hispanic Latinx community as well. And here from the this was from a economic development report talking about Scranton being one of the Appalachian cities in which the population of every racial and ethnic group except non-Hispanic whites is increasing. So we're going to grow our community here, grow our population because of people coming here who are coming as immigrants and refugees. Those long-standing communities that we saw in the last slide, the Irish, the Italians, that's the historic base of Scranton, but that's not a growing population. That population is either kind of staying stat or even out-migrating. So this is who we are going into the future, that Scranton is going to be an increasingly diverse city, and we need to embrace that and think about how we can support these communities. Dr. Allison has talked a little bit about this. Jenny's going to also touch on it, but just very briefly, we're going to be using obviously different terms, thinking about refugees, asylum seekers, immigrant, migrant. There's a lot on there. I'm gonna let Jenny talk about it a little bit more when she gets into some of the different kind of classes of immigrants. But also to say that every person is more than these labels, obviously. So we talk about people with these terms, refugee, asylum seeker, but everybody is more than that, and they have a story behind how they've gotten here and what their life will be into the future. So current migration, I'm going to have 2 slides here just talking about the migration that's coming from Latin America, and then Jenny's going to really go into depth on that. And then I'll just talk a little bit about refugee resettlement. We're not talking about that as much today, but I think it's still important to just get a sense of our context here in Scranton. So since 2000, we've had, again, a growing population increase, but it also goes back before that. So our Hispanic, Latinx communities are not just recent immigrants. They've also, in some cases been here for 30, 40, would you say?
Yeah, around 40 years.
Around 40 years. Sometimes that's a misconception too, that people are just coming here really recently. In some cases, it's been decades. These are the countries that we would say are the biggest population. So Mexico, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico as a U.S. territory, Honduras, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Uruguay, Colombia, and Brazil. But there may be others as well, but those are some of the bigger representation. We also have refugee resettlement to Scranton, and that comes in a very specific way. So that is through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Refugees are mostly interviewed and sort of vetted, not in the United States, so in another country, in a refugee camp. They go through a long process. So in most cases, the folks who are coming from the southern border, or as what Jenny's going to talk about, are not in this category. And this gives you kind of a rundown of the communities that have come here. The largest community that we have in Scranton that's come through refugee resettlement is the Bhutanese community. There are several thousand. They're both primary and secondary refugees, meaning they came to Scranton first, or they came from another city that they had settled in before they came to Scranton. The next biggest group is the Congolese, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the refugees that are coming here today are largely Congolese. During COVID, a lot of our refugee resettlement really was stopped, and the Congolese were the ones who were kind of waiting in line, and they are the ones who are coming now. Syrians, we had a very small number of Syrians because the U.S. stopped welcoming Syrians during the Trump administration, so we got a very small number, and that remains a smaller community. Now we have Afghans coming in the last year. Some Ukrainians are also coming, and these are some of the highlights of the communities. So I'm going to shift now and let Jenny really talk about the reasons that Latinx immigrants are coming to Scranton and what that looks like.
Thank you. So again, my name is Jenny. So what I'm going to be talking about are some of the reasons that in my work I have learned that a lot of the growing Hispanic Latinx community members have been moving to northeastern Pennsylvania in general. So a lot of the work that I did was doing a lot of work with immigrants in the Hazleton, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. In more recent years, it has really focused more in Scranton. And really, you keep hearing the same reasons that we've learned through history textbooks about what older waves of immigrants were the same reasons that they were coming to the United States. Economic and job opportunities are probably the number one thing that you hear from all of these Hispanic and Latinx immigrant families. Educational opportunities for themselves, but oftentimes for their children as well, and safety. A lot of people are fleeing their native countries due to a lot of the violence that has been happening in different parts of the world for different reasons. But in recent years, what we've learned through my work in the STARS program, but also at the Community Justice Project, is that there has been an increase in asylum seekers. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons that we're seeing more asylum seekers moving to this particular area. But before I get into that, I did want to just kind of present an overview of the different immigrant classes of U.S. admission into the United States. There are about 5 or 6 categories of different ways that immigrants can enter the United States. The first one is the immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. So these individuals are the U.S. citizens who are petitioning spouses, children, parents, adopted children. They are the ones that are given prioritization to be able to legally come into the United States. The waiting period tends to be shorter, usually within a year and a half, and the family reunification happens. Then there's the second preference, which is the family-sponsored preferences. And that is broken down into prioritization categories. The first being unmarried children of U.S. citizens and their children. Again, unmarried, that's leaving out the married children. The second prioritization is spouses, children, and unmarried children of alien residents. Alien residents is referring to legal permanent residents, people who have green cards. Again, that is leaving out married children, married adults. The third prioritization is married children of U.S. citizens and their spouses and children. And the fourth category is the brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, at least 21 years of age, and their spouses and children. This is leaving out the married children of legal permanent residents. In none of those categories is there an option for the married children of legal permanent residents to be able to come in through this family-sponsored preference. And this system has really developed a lot of complex issues when it comes to family reunification. Because of these categories, there are a lot of people who are in this waiting period for decades. So depending on where the people are from originally, so people from Mexico who are living in the United States, are legal permanent residents or U.S. Citizens who are petitioning their family members in either of the second, third, or fourth category. In many cases, they're waiting up to 30 years. We've seen that a lot with people from India, people from Indonesia. So then in 30 years, a lot of changes are happening. If the petitioner dies, then what happens? Will that family reunification ever happen because the petitioner, the U.S. citizen or the legal permanent resident is no longer there, or vice versa? What if the person being petitioned dies? Then what happens? So it is a very complex system. It's very unfair many times, but this has really created waiting periods for very specific groups of people for very, very long periods of time. Then there's the employment-based preference, again, also categorized by priority. First, it's given to professors, researchers, multinational executives. Second, professionals with advanced degrees. Really, the United States, I think, comes up with, who falls under these categories. Then there's this third, fourth, and fifth category. The fifth one is for people who are coming here and creating jobs and are considered investors. The waiting periods under this preference is not as long or anywhere near as long as the family-sponsored preference. Then there's the refugees and asylees category. And again, the refugees program is really for people seeking protection outside of the country. So as Julie mentioned, this really happens elsewhere in another country. Once they are given that refugee status, then they are or granted refugee status is when they are able to legally come into the United States. The asylum program is usually happening once the individual is at a port of entry or is in the United States. And what we have learned, I'm not an immigration attorney, so I don't know the details of all of this, but what we have learned through different conversations with families is what ends up happening is that they reach a U.S. territory or the mainland here, usually at the Mexican border, and they, are detained by ICE officials or Border Patrol, and they will explain, I'm seeking entry because I'm fleeing my country because I am afraid for my life. Depending on who the officer is, they will let them in and they will tell them, all right, we are temporarily allowing you to come into the country. And then what ends up happening is from what we hear, is that they are detained, usually at some kind of detention center, somewhere close to the border, while they start all this the asylum claims process. Eventually, these individuals will be released to family members or friends within the United States, and a lot of these individuals end up coming to places like Scranton. But now they have now they have this asylum claim pending. And I'll get into more detail as to some of the challenges with that. Another category is the diversity category, which is really a lottery system, and it's given to people from countries with very low levels of immigration to the United States. So a lot of these, the people that end up getting admissions through the diversity program we've heard is a lot of people from European countries. And then this other. And this is the other category is people that are being admitted under very special circumstances. So people who are paroled in, again, temporarily, or people who are fighting a deportation or removal case and are being ordered cancellation of removals by an immigration judge. So they're being told, okay, we're going to allow you to stay here. We're canceling your deportation or removal, at least for right now, unless something changes in your home country. And then there's this entered without inspection. So this is what sometimes we hear about in the news media. People who are not eligible to enter through any of these immigrant classes of admission, oftentimes the only way to enter the United States to reunite with their families or to seek safety is by entering without inspection. So entering through the border illegally, because ultimately they are seeking that American dream like any other immigrant that is trying to get into the United States. There was another, and it's not in here, but there was another one that I wanted to kind of just discuss quickly, which was another type of admission. It's for non-immigrants, and that's for people who are coming here on tourist visas for business purposes, for very limited work purposes. Again, a lot of people, in order to be able to be eligible for those types of programs to enter, even if it's just temporarily, and they're considered non-immigrants, a lot of the people, in order to get those types of visa, it's very, very complex. Many times, for example, in Mexico, we've heard people are required to have a certain level of education, are supposed to have certain assets. Again, they're supposed to prove to the government that they're not intending to stay in the United States. So again, people who want to reunite with their family are not going to meet those requirements under the non-immigrant classes of admission. So, who are the Latinx Hispanic immigrants who have found their way to Scranton? Really, in the 90s and up to the early 2000s, a lot of the Hispanic and Latinx immigrants moving to northeastern Pennsylvania were moving here from larger cities like New Jersey, New York, Los Angeles. Since then, though, from like the early 2000s up until I want to say the pandemic, or a little bit before the pandemic, more of the Hispanic and Latinx immigrants started moving to northeastern Pennsylvania upon entering the United States. Why? Because there has been a growing Hispanic and Latinx immigrant community here, and so they're establishing roots here. So people are coming to the United States, and they're, rather than going the traditional route of going into these larger cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Philly, they're coming to areas like Hazleton, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, because they have family ties here now. They have family members that have been here a decade, 2 or 3 decades, and are starting to establish again those longer-term roots, are learning about the social and economic opportunities here. So they're trying to build that connection for these community members. Post-pandemic, there has been an increase in the immigrants moving to NEPA, both from larger cities and upon immediately entering the United States. So since 2020, we have met so many people from the Hispanic and Latinx immigrant community saying, oh, I moved from New York City or from New Jersey or from Connecticut because lower cost of living, job opportunities, better educational, the education system is considered better compared to a lot of these inner city areas. But then we're also learning that there has also been a continued growth in people moving or coming to northeastern Pennsylvania as they're entering the United States, again, because of the family ties that are already here. And what we're also learning is that there are more family units coming to this area, so adults and children who are coming as asylum seekers, and that has really increased since the pandemic started. What hasn't really changed that I've learned is that there's still a lot of young men or single men who are coming to this area, usually non-asylum seekers, but are attracted to areas like Scranton because of very specific job industries in construction, landscaping, roofing, and now the stone quarries. So even a lot of these men that are coming now are not even coming to Scranton. Now they're starting to move farther up north, Mishapin, Halstead, because they're hearing that there's consistent, reliable, good-paying jobs in these industries. So they're not even coming to Scranton, I'm learning. A lot of them are going straight to very rural parts of Pennsylvania. So what was happening in Scranton, Hazleton, Wilkes-Barre 20, 30 years ago, you're starting to see that pattern happening in more rural parts of the state as well. And I was talking about this a little bit earlier. So with the uptick in families and individuals admitted into the U.S. under asylum claims, we've seen specifically in this area people who are coming from Central and South America. But more specifically, and actually I was a little surprised, was more, I mean, not surprised, but a lot of people from Mexico and Haiti who have pending asylum cases. And I guess it makes sense. In Mexico, there have been a lot of issues with the cartels, and a lot of the families that we've spoken to have been threatened by the cartels or are being extortioned by the cartels, and so they're seeking safety. Again, a lot of family units, whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, you would see a lot of individual men from Mexico moving here. Now you're starting to see more family units, again, under asylum claims. And again, as I was mentioning before, what we're learning is that they present themselves at some kind of port of entry at the Mexican border, and then they're detained, and eventually they're released to some kind of family or friend, and then they end up in areas like Scranton. Once in Scranton, though, once they have they started the process for these asylum claims, the first thing that they have to do is find an immigration attorney. Because many times once they're released, they leave that border town or that, Texas, Arizona, wherever it is that they are. They come to places like Pennsylvania, and now they are seeking for an immigration attorney that will help them transfer that case from the court system in Texas or in Arizona now to Philadelphia. And so with that, there's a big challenge because this area doesn't have enough immigration attorneys or immigration attorneys that are experts in asylum law. And so that is in itself is very complex, it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and there's a limited time that they're supposed to start getting this entire process started. And then on top of that, if you're claiming asylum, the burden is on the immigrant to prove to the government that your claims are real. And so with that, there requires a lot of documentation, proof, research. And you don't necessarily, if you're fleeing your country, you're not necessarily carrying all this proof or pictures or newspaper clippings of all the things that are happening in your town to show to the government here, this is what's happening in my town. So oftentimes they have to go back and forth between their consulates. So if you're coming from Central America on an asylum claim, now you have to figure out how to transfer your immigration case to Philadelphia, travel back and forth between northeastern Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, but now you got to go to New York City to deal with your consulate to get birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, consular IDs or passports, things that oftentimes at the border are taken away from you and not always given back to you. So it's a lot of going back and forth, and that's one of the biggest challenge that we're learning with a lot of the recent individuals that are, not only recent, but we've always known, but especially for the individuals that are entering upon these asylum claims and have a limited time to be able to present their case. So some of the context and realities for the different immigrant Latinx community members in this area, this is what they're facing once they come to northeastern Pennsylvania. There's linguistic challenges. So English, this is a predominantly English-speaking area, a white community. And when you don't speak English and you don't understand your rights and you don't understand how the education system works, how the healthcare system works, that creates a lot of additional barriers in addition to you dealing with your immigration situation. With that, there's workforce concerns. You might not have the skills that certain industries are looking for. Or on the other end, you might be a lawyer or an architect in your native country, and then you're coming here and you're not able to use that skill. You're not able to use that education in the United States. So then they find themselves having to take other types of jobs, after all the work that they put in their native country. With immigration status, though, if you are in this limbo status, either because you entered without inspection, so you're undocumented, or you're in your asylum case is pending, you're not always giving a work permit. So if you're not given a work permit, you don't have access to a social security number. And if you don't have access to a social security number, you don't have access to certain job opportunities that may pay a living wage. So your job opportunities are being limited to, some employment that or employers that might be exploiting these community members. And with that, if you don't have the right immigration status and you don't have access to a good paying job and you don't know your rights and you don't speak English, and on top of that, you're not eligible for subsidized programs that are created in this country to be able to help and empower and support the vulnerable populations, the low-income families, you're going to be at risk of marginalization. You're going to be vulnerable to being exploited. And again, a lot of these families, because of their immigration status, do not have access to certain job opportunities, but do not have access to these support systems in place created by the government, such as access to subsidized childcare, access to subsidized housing or shelter, access to food stamps, things of that sort. The parents nor the children who are coming and don't have these, pending cases are kind of in this limbo status, just kind of waiting around. And I don't know about you, but I'm sure there's many of us that can only do so much for a certain amount of period in financially supporting an individual or in some cases a whole family unit. So it's very difficult for a lot of these families. And so a lot of times they're relying on their social support systems, which is their family, their friends, and churches. Or community organizations. But we have a lot of work to do in that area. So then there's this question of, is Scranton a welcoming city? And I think this was an article from...
Yeah, we just pulled a couple of things here. I mean, we do like to think of ourselves as a welcoming city, and I think we are in many ways. In the Scranton Story, our Nation Story project, we came across this quote from the 1902 anthracite strike hearings. So this was talking about these, largely European folks who were coming over, and remembering that Italians and Irish did not have access to whiteness. As soon as they immigrated here. And so this was a kind of the manager of one of the companies saying, these men don't suffer. Why, hell, half of them don't even speak English. So this idea at that point that, people who didn't speak English shouldn't sort of be treated humanely. And unfortunately, that sentiment continues. So as Jenny has talked about, linguistic concerns. So thinking about the city of Scranton, if you need to go to a courtroom, you need to go to school, you need to go to, City Hall. A lot of those places in Scranton have not had language access for years. It has gotten a lot better. Jenny's done a ton of work through Community Justice Project, through a lot of advocacy. I've seen it with the refugee communities, but we have a long way to go in terms of what that looks like, and having people walk into the door and not be treated like a burden, frankly, if they have to use language line or if they have to have, bring in a translator. And our colleagues in the Language Learning Lab in World Languages have done wonderful work to do translation, but that's a major way that Scranton is still having growing pains, I would say, around. And I think, too, people will remember back to when their families immigrated here and they only spoke Polish or they only spoke those languages, and it wasn't a stigma necessarily. Monsignor Quinn, who was the pastor of the St. John Newman Parish, would talk about how those church services were in Polish, and that was an accepted thing. But then we will have sometimes kind of a rejection of having, church services today in Spanish. So many people accept it, but there is still some sentiment of saying, everyone needs to speak English now immediately when you get to the United States. What else do we have here? These are just other examples of, a lot of efforts. Welcoming Scranton is an event that's done by United Neighborhood Centers. We have World Refugee Day. So obviously the university, Marywood, lots of ways in which we have come around our immigrant and refugee neighbors. But then there's also other types of political wins. This was a headline, How American Freedom is Under Attack by Flying Illegal Immigrants into the Wilkes-Barre Scranton International Airport. This was just a few months ago. There were actually people in NEPA who sort of flocked to the airport and used their camera phones to kind of videotape it and sort of create a controversy. And these were migrant children. This was not something that was being done secretly, but it created this sort of paranoia, actually, about that particular incident.
And really what we wanted to end with, and I'm not sure if that's our last slide, no, was that this particular immigrant group is seeking what most immigrants are seeking in the United States is, that opportunity, the American dream. And so when we're working with the different families, at least in the STARS program, so these are pictures of families that we work with in the STARS program at Marywood, they see Northeastern Pennsylvania, they see Scranton as their long-term home. They see their children establishing roots here as well. And, they want the best for their children, as most of us do. And so, STARS really is here to introduce our families to different systems, to even different cultures and different ways of how things are done in this area, in the education system, in the healthcare system, and the criminal justice system, because a lot of it comes down to working with the community and educating our community, but it also goes vice versa. So again, the community is here, and I think Julie was saying the demographics are changing, and they're changing quickly, and it's only going to continue changing. And so really as a community, I think that we need to continue working together to make sure that we are, creating a very healthy community without leaving certain community members out, so that overall areas like Scranton are going to flourish. The Hispanic community is projected to be the majority in a few decades from now. So we really, really need to start focusing on what we're doing as a society today to make sure that they are in the right path for, successful integration and success overall. So,
Do you want to play this one? This is
yes.
just a brief. It didn't work. I had to pull it out. Let's see. I'm just going to play a brief video. This is an interview.
First thing is, when I first came, we were called the newcomers and the intruders. There was a very hard time to adapt, to open up a community that can merge into one. It was very hard. A lot of people had resentment of seeing newcomers. But I had an old friend here in Hazleton, and she told me stories about how any other population that had come to Hazleton had gone through the same thing. The Irish did it, the Italian too. It says, you're just the new generation that's coming, and things are gonna be bad, but then they're gonna get better. And it did, it did. And we need to learn from that and keeping the history. And is unfortunate events that are happening in this, and we can't forget that. Because before was the mine, now are the factories. And what the factory did during the COVID pandemic, it was as bad as what they did with the coal miners. It was as bad.
I think that was the end.
I think you have one more. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And then we just wanted to end with, the Latino community, the Latinx community has a lot to contribute to our community, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that all over the city of Scranton. You're seeing that if you take a drive down Pittston Avenue, Cedar Avenue, you're going to see so many storefronts, so many restaurants that are Latino owned and that are thriving. So, again, even a lot of what the local churches are doing. Now there's a La Mega radio station that, from what they told me, they have over 60,000 listeners from northeastern Pennsylvania. So, the community is growing. It's a good thing. All these changes are great things. This was from a lot of this information. Sorry, I thought 3 slides ago we were almost done. But this is the last slide. Yes, it is. These were some numbers that we pulled from, I forget what the website is, but basically in Pennsylvania, it's talking about the immigrants in PA. 7% of the population, immigrants are 7% of the population. 9% of PA residents are native born with one immigrant parent. 85,000 plus PA residents live with at least one undocumented family member. Most immigrants have pursued education at or above the college level. 9% of workers in the PA labor force are 9% of workers in PA labor force across sectors and industries, and immigrants pay billions of dollars into taxes. That's especially really important because there's this misconception that undocumented people do not pay taxes. They do. They pay taxes because every undocumented immigrant's one wish on their priority list is to have a pathway to citizenship. And one way that you prove that you've been a contributor to the United States is through paying your taxes. So people are not here living off of the government, off of public benefits because they are not eligible for it. If anything, they're paying into the tax system and they are not getting anything in return for it. And nothing is guaranteeing that they will ever get anything in return because under current immigration federal policies, many of these people do not and will not have a pathway to citizenship. And I hope that federal immigration policies do change, especially for people who have been here for decades as undocumented immigrants and have been contributing to the economy. So yes, I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Before we transition back to you, Dr. Allison, we're going to do the drawing. And I see that our provost, Dr. Maldonado, is here. Would you want to draw for us? Yes.
All right, just a few more thoughts. I was trying to bring it all together, right? We go back to the 1980s, 90s, like for the most part, like most of the people who were trying to come across the U.S. Mexico border tended to be from Mexico. They tended to be men. They tended to be looking for economic opportunity. They would often come here for a season or a couple of seasons and then return to Mexico. And things have changed since then as the U.S. borders become more and more fortified, right? More walls, more border agents. There's drones along the border. But also who is coming has changed as well, and that it's a much more diverse group of people who are coming to the U.S. border with, as we just heard, with very mixed motives, right? There's still economic opportunity, but it's also people fleeing violence, natural disasters, and trying to come together with family who lives in the United States. There's some family unification issues, right? So we think about the asylum, Title 42, which came into place again in March 2020. And in some ways, one of the problems with it, and one, it's really an asylum ban masquerading as a public health precaution, right? And that if you look at it, the CDC order does not apply to U.S. citizens, right, or lawful permanent residents, their spouses, their children. Doesn't apply to U.S. military. Doesn't apply to those who come through a port of entry with valid travel documents, right? It only applies to those who are, who are at the U.S. Mexico border, originally the U.S. Canada border, without documentation, whether they were at a port of entry, which is where you would go cross the border and give your passport to the agent, or in between ports of entry. And in many ways, the Title 42 doesn't allow people to apply for asylum. It just expels them and says, you're here, there's a public health emergency, you must leave, regardless of why you're coming. So there are a lot of people who are allowed through, but if you were U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents, but even if there were a lot of, not loopholes, but it seemed to change every few hours, every few days or months about who could or who could not sort of be exempted from Title 42, which again, every time it questioned, well, if it's a public health emergency, why is it sort of applying so haphazardly? The other is that, if we think about why people are coming, Title 42 does nothing about that, right? If people are fleeing violence in their home countries, they're fleeing gang violence, the consequences of the Cold War, street gangs that were actually created in California, and then many of the individuals who had originally joined the gangs were deported to Central America, causing such chaos, and now people are fleeing from the region 10, 15 years later. Title 42 doesn't resolve any of those issues. It doesn't take into consideration why people were fleeing. I heard a lot of times in Mexico in particular, but also in Honduras, parts of Guatemala, people are fleeing because of drug trafficking, cartels, and for many of them, they said they wouldn't have this problem if we didn't have such a high demand for drugs, right? The drugs are from the United States. We're the biggest market, and the second largest market is Europe. If we didn't have such a demand for illegal drugs, many of these weak governments, the violence wouldn't be there. There's also, violence against women and climate change, right? And that we've seen like huge storms, massive storms hitting Central America that has been displacing entire communities, right? So people are fleeing they've always fled for a variety of reasons, but I think we're much more aware that why people might leave their home community, which is most people don't want to leave their homes, their community, right? That must be really terrible or really difficult to force them to leave. And then we also heard, well, people are coming here for a particular reason, right? And some is family, right? There's millions of people of Central American descent or Mexican descent who live in the United States whose family members are now trying to reunite with them because we've heard it's so difficult for anyone to actually get a tourist visa and come visit their family in the United States. There's a demand every day, every few days we see in the United States how there's jobs available for anybody in almost any industry in the United States. And so people are, it used to be, and it really still is the case, where different companies would contract out and they would have people down in Central America and Mexico recruiting people to come to the United States. They'd give them addresses and they'd tell them where to come in the United States, and they'd get a kickback for helping people leave Central America to come here to the United States. So U.S. businesses were recruiting people. Natural disasters in the United States, if you think about what's happened in our country, after every natural disaster, it's often undocumented immigrants who are helping rebuild our cities or clean them up. Right? In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, it's one of the largest locations of Hondurans in the world, or outside of Honduras. We've seen plenty of people come to the New York area after Superstorm Sandy, and more recently, everyone went to Florida this few months ago after the hurricanes there to help rebuild. Others are U.S. law, the two parts at the bottom. There's an act that was passed about 15 years ago that said we need to look at young people coming to the United States without any adults as a potential victim of trafficking, right? We just need to, if they're 15, 16 years old, we can't just deport them or expel them. And so this has caused a lot of the challenges in the U.S. immigration system to try and figure out who these young people are and how do we respond, right? So this Trafficking Act was signed by George Bush. That becomes an issue very frequently, a challenge. And DACA, about, we heard, people have been here for 20, 25 years at times, and their status, or legal status, is in limbo. And we just haven't resolved it. And so it's just created a very difficult, environment in the United States around immigration. And with the Title 42 that says, we're expelling everyone who comes to the border, it pretty much means you're stuck on the other side of the border. You're in Nuevo Laredo, you're in Mexico, in northern Mexico, in all different parts, in Nogales, Tamaulipas. And so we have tens of thousands, really hundreds of thousands of individuals right now who are on the other side of the border, waiting to try and figure out what's going to go on or what is happening with U.S. law. That tends to change weekly, monthly. But what's interesting, or really frustrating for many people, is that the conditions on the border are different by city. that what the legal environment around like Nogales and Mexico, Arizona is different from South Texas. And it can change based on who you are, whether you're an adult, whether you're a child, whether you're with the family, whether you're from Honduras, whether you're from Afghanistan. And that affects, that people just trying to make sense of U.S. law, which is extremely challenging. Again, 20 years ago, it was a lot of people from Mexico who were coming, and then 2013, 2014, we were having many of these events here at the University of Scranton about people coming from Central America. But now, most people arriving at the U.S. border, many of them are coming from Colombia, right? From Cuba, Nicaragua, Peru, Haiti, we heard, and really the largest tends to be Venezuela. Right? Venezuela's, about 6 million people fled Venezuela in the last few years, with about 4 million of them in Colombia. Hundreds of thousands gone to Peru and Chile, and we've had relatively small numbers. But it means that our immigration policy or asylum policy is trying to keep up with what country people are coming from, and Title 42 again does nothing about that. Right? So here's some Venezuelan migrants along the border. Title 42, again, it stops people from applying for asylum. We say asylum's a right. It's a human right. It's a legal right. Under U.S. law, you're allowed to apply for asylum. You're allowed to apply for asylum, which means you're fleeing persecution in your home country based upon race, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. And you can, under U.S. law, under law, you can only apply it once you're in the country. So that means it's at a port of entry, or if you just step across the border. Right? There's no way if you're on this side of the U.S. Mexico border in Mexico, you can apply for asylum. So you have to cross the border. And there's been a variety of different policies that administrations have put in place to make it more difficult for people to go to ports of entry, right? To go to the officer and ask for asylum. That actually forces them to try, to go around the official way of asking for asylum. So Title 42 just encourages that because it expels people. It doesn't process them. It doesn't allow them to apply for asylum. And so we've had about 1.8 million people in the last 3 years now expelled through Title 42 at the border. 900,000 of them are the same, that they're repeat crossers. Because it used to be where if you cross the border, like your second or third time, you might be, placed in a detention facility in the United States for months, perhaps longer, as a punishment, as a deterrent. And so not that was a good solution to what was going on at the border, but it made people think, all right, I've been apprehended once or twice. If I do it again, I might be in detention or in a facility for 6 months, 9 months. Maybe I'm going to go home. Maybe I'm not going to do it again. But Title 42 means you're not processed. You're just expelled. So there was one guy who's been expelled about 90 times, just one person, because he would cross in the morning, the afternoon, at night. And there was no deterrence, no consequences. And so Title 42, for many of us, is like, it really just kicked the can down the road. It doesn't address the conditions at the border. It doesn't improve the asylum policy. It does nothing about why people are leaving. And for some, we repeat over and over again, when you look at Title 42 going into place in 2020, apprehensions have increased. Now we think of it more as a failed policy, where some think it's a really solution to the border, but their idea of solution is that people are not allowed to apply for asylum. Our idea, it's a failed policy because it just keeps, it creates this, cycle of people coming across the border and getting expelled and coming back again, leaving them vulnerable to tremendous amounts of violence on the Mexico side of the border. And because the law varies from city to city along the border, there are certain communities that say, if you cannot, if you are an unaccompanied minor under 18 and you cross, you'll be processed and maybe sent to family members in the United States. Whereas if you're with the parent, you won't. You'll just be deported as family unit. Some cities in Mexico won't allow that to occur anymore. But it's led to lots of families with that really difficult decision to say, we're stuck in northern Mexico, we can't cross. But if we send our child, who could be 6, 7, 8, 12, 15, to cross on their own, they might be allowed into the United States to file their asylum claim. So the policy of Title 42 really is another family separation policy that is, again, really making what's already a vulnerable population even more vulnerable. The last thing is just what is the future, right? The Biden administration's trying to walk a fine line that satisfies nobody. It's more complicated than many would like it to be, and they're criticized for whatever goes wrong or right. But they've been trying to, right now, try and peel back or replace Title 42 with something else. And there's different governors in the United States that keep going to court to say, you cannot end Title 42 because there's a public health crisis going on in the country, and we can't allow all these asylum seekers in. It makes it odd that it's usually the governor of Texas and the governor of Florida that are the ones saying there's a public health crisis in the United States. We need to keep Title 42, which is why some people think it's more of an asylum ban rather than a public health crisis. But now it looks like as of May, the Biden administration is just saying the public health crisis is over. So therefore, Title 42 will go away, with the overall policy going away in the United States. But no one's the Supreme Court right now was going to have a hearing, but since the Biden administration said the public health crisis is going away, the Supreme Court said, well, then there's no reason for us to hear Title 42 or a challenge to it. But we still think this isn't the end of the story. But as of right now, Title 40, the public health crisis in the United States is going away in May, which means Title 42 might go away with it. But the Biden administration is trying to come up with something that replaces it, that it is, that definitely is not something that it's not satisfying anyone on the left or the right, because in many ways we just call it's another asylum ban. It's just really replacing what was one asylum ban with very few opportunities to appeal the ban, to a ban with a few more opportunities to appeal. But in a sense, it's still a ban. So we'll leave it up to everyone else to talk about. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Allison, and to also our other guest speakers for tonight. One more round of applause.